Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. Tonight's story is about the geography of love and the anatomy of a lie. For 15 years, my marriage was a landscape I knew better than my own reflection, a place of safety and profound, unshakable trust. When that landscape was ravaged by a sudden, incurable illness, I watched my wife transform into something more than a partner. She became my savior, my angel, the sole reason I survived. I spent years rebuilding my broken body, all the while worshiping her sacrifice. I saw her as a saint. It was only when I was strong enough to finally stand on my own 2 feet that I discovered her sainthood was a performance. Her halo was a mask, and her loving care was nothing more than the patient, meticulous maintenance of a long-term investment she was waiting to cash in. My life with Corrine was, for all intents and purposes, a testament to quiet, comfortable success. We were a perfectly balanced equation. I was the pragmatist, an engineer by trade, a man who found comfort in numbers, logic, and predictable outcomes. She was the artist, a vibrant, passionate soul who worked in graphic design, a woman who painted our world in bright, beautiful colors. I was the anchor, she was the sails, and together we navigated the complexities of life with a grace and efficiency that was the envy of our friends. Our love was not a fiery, dramatic thing. It was a deep, slow-burning hearth that warmed every corner of our lives. We were a team, a single unit moving through the world. Our finances, our decisions, our dreams, everything was a shared enterprise. So when my body began to betray me, it felt like a betrayal not just of myself, but of us. It started subtly, a tremor in my hand that I dismissed as stress, a sudden weakness in my legs that I attributed to a pinched nerve. But the symptoms grew slowly, insidiously, like a vine strangling a tree. The journey through the medical establishment was a descent into a world of sterile corridors, impersonal tests, and the anxious, unreadable expressions of doctors. Finally, after months of uncertainty, we were given a name for my tormentor: primary lateral sclerosis, a rare, degenerative neuromuscular disease. It was, the neurologist explained with a practiced, somber gentleness, a cousin to ALS but slower, less predictable. It wasn't a death sentence, he said, but it was a life sentence. My body would continue its slow, inexorable decline. My muscles would weaken, my mobility would vanish. I would, in time, become a prisoner in my own skin. The diagnosis was a bomb that detonated in the heart of our perfect life, and the blast radius leveled everything. My career, my hobbies, my independence, all of it was vaporized in an instant. My grief was a bottomless, suffocating thing. But through that grief, Corrine emerged as a figure of almost divine strength. As my world shrank, hers seemed to expand to encompass all of my needs. She became my rock, my advocate, my warrior. She quit her job, a decision she framed as no decision at all, to become my full-time caregiver. She dove into the complexities of my disease, learning the medical jargon, challenging doctors, and managing the labyrinthine bureaucracy of our health insurance. She was magnificent. Her days became a blur of my needs, a complex regimen of medications, physical therapy sessions, the physically demanding and often humiliating tasks of helping me with the basics of daily living. She never faltered, never complained. Her patience was infinite, her compassion a boundless ocean in which I found a fragile sense of safety. I was consumed with a toxic mixture of gratitude and guilt. I watched this vibrant, brilliant woman I loved chain herself to my broken body, and the sacrifice was so profound it brought me to tears. She handled everything, including our finances. The disability payments were a fraction of my former salary, and our savings began to dwindle at an alarming rate. It was Corrine who took control, creating a new, brutally lean budget. She was the one who had the difficult conversations about our life insurance, a policy we had taken out years ago as a sensible precaution. Now, it was a grim reality we had to manage. She made sure the premiums were paid, that the paperwork was in order. I saw it as another act of her incredible, pragmatic love, facing the ugliest possibilities head-on so that I wouldn't have to. I was too sick, too depressed, too overwhelmed to even think about it. I trusted her implicitly. My life was in her hands, and I had never felt safer. In the darkest moments when the depression was a physical weight, she would hold me and whisper, "We are a team. Your fight is my fight. We will get through this together." I believed her. I clung to her words as a drowning man clings to a raft. She was my angel, the one perfect, beautiful thing in the wreckage of my life. My love for her, which I thought had already reached its peak, deepened into a form of worship. She wasn't just my wife. She was my reason for continuing to draw breath. I had no idea that she was not just my caregiver, but the patient, diligent executor of an estate that hadn't even been settled yet. The next 3 years were a slow, grinding descent. My body continued its steady, traitorous decline, each new day bringing a fresh loss of function, a new indignity. I went from a cane to a walker to the permanent confinement of a wheelchair. My world shrank to the four walls of our bedroom, the view from the window my only connection to a life I used to inhabit. Through it all, Corrine was a constant, unwavering presence. Her devotion seemed to grow in direct proportion to my deterioration. She read to me for hours, managed my increasingly complex medical needs, and fought with insurance companies for every scrap of coverage. She was my champion, my protector, my everything. The financial strain was immense. Our savings were gone. We were living on the knife's edge, a single unexpected medical bill away from complete ruin. I watched with a sense of helpless shame as Corrine began to sell off parts of our life to keep us afloat. First, it was her car. Then, a collection of art we had acquired over the years. Then, pieces of her own jewelry, heirlooms from her grandmother. Each sacrifice was a fresh wound in my heart. I would protest, my voice weak and slurred, but she would simply smile, a sad, beautiful, resolute smile, and say, "They're just things, my love. You are what matters." Her selflessness was so absolute it felt sacred. I felt as though I was witnessing a daily act of martyrdom, and I was the cross she had chosen to bear. She was my angel, and I, the anchor dragging her down. It was during this bleak period that a new doctor, a young, ambitious neurologist, suggested a radical, experimental treatment. It was a new form of gene therapy, available only through a clinical trial at a research hospital several states away. The chances of it working were, he admitted, infinitesimally small. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary pass in the final seconds of a losing game. The cost, even with the trial covering some of it, was astronomical. It would require us to sell our house, the last significant asset we had left. It meant liquidating the final repository of our shared history, the home I had thought I would die in. My first instinct was to refuse. It was too much to ask of her. We were already drowning, and this felt like tying a boulder to our feet. But Corrine would not hear of it. She was incandescent with a fierce, desperate hope. "We have to try," she insisted, her eyes shining with a conviction that momentarily blew away my own fog of despair. "We have to fight. I am not giving up on you." Her strength was infectious. I found myself swept up in her determination. The house went on the market. We sold it quickly, for less than it was worth, the priority being immediate cash. I watched from my wheelchair as movers packed up our life into boxes, the sound of sealing tape, a funereal rhythm marking the end of our life as we knew it. We moved into a small, sterile rental apartment near the research hospital, our world now reduced to 2 rooms and a hope so fragile it felt like it could shatter at any moment. The treatment was brutal. Months of infusions, tests, and a litany of side effects that left me weaker and more miserable than ever before. Corrine was by my side through it all, sleeping on a cot in my hospital room, holding my hand through the worst of it. There were times I wanted to give up, to surrender to the inevitable, but her belief in the treatment in me was a force of nature that would not let me quit. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to change. A flicker of movement in a finger I hadn't been able to control for years. A decrease in the constant, agonizing muscle spasms. It was so small I thought I was imagining it. But then a nurse noticed it. Then a doctor confirmed it. The 1 in a million shot was hitting its mark. The gene therapy was working. The recovery was a slow, arduous crawl back into the world of the living. It was a process of years, not months, but with each small victory, the first time I could hold a fork, the first time I could stand with the help of parallel bars, the first time I took a shuffling step with a walker, we celebrated as if we had won the lottery. The doctors called my case a medical miracle. They wrote papers about it. I was the statistical anomaly, the man who had walked back from the edge of a cliff. Throughout my recovery, Corrine was my cheerleader, my coach, my constant source of encouragement. On the surface, her joy was as profound as my own. She cried tears of happiness at every milestone. She was the perfect image of the devoted wife whose prayers had been answered. But as my mind grew clearer, as the fog of illness and heavy medication began to lift, I started to notice things. Small, dissonant moments that I couldn't quite process. A flicker of something in her eyes when I achieved a new physical goal, something that looked less like joy and more like calculation. A certain tension in her smile when I started talking about the future, about maybe working again, about rebuilding our lives. I dismissed it as my own paranoia, a side effect of the trauma we had endured. She had been a caregiver for so long, perhaps she was struggling to let go of that role. She was worried about me, worried I would push myself too hard and relapse. Her concern was just another facet of her deep, abiding love. I told myself this over and over, quieting the small, insistent voice in my head that whispered that something was wrong. My recovery was a miracle. Our love had triumphed over a terrible disease. I had to believe in that narrative. It was the only thing that made the sacrifice, the loss of our entire world, meaningful. I clung to the image of my angel, refusing to see the shadow that was beginning to form just behind her. My physical recovery far outpaced my financial one. By the time I was able to walk unassisted and live a life of near normalcy, we were financially devastated. The money from the house was long gone, spent on the treatment and years of living expenses. We were living month to month on my meager long-term disability payments, in a small apartment that felt more like a cage than a home. But I was filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I was a man given a second chance, and I was determined to make the most of it. I began to talk in earnest about rebuilding. I started networking, looking for consulting work I could do from home, drafting plans for a new, smaller life. I was full of energy, of ideas, of hope. And with every step I took towards reclaiming our future, Corrine seemed to retreat further into a strange, brittle anxiety. Her support, which had once been my bedrock, now felt conditional, laced with a constant stream of warnings and worries. When I brought up looking at our finances together to create a real plan for our future, she would shut down the conversation. "You need to focus on your health, my love," she'd say, her voice full of a cloying, patronizing sweetness. "Don't stress your mind with numbers. I have it all under control. Just trust me." And for a while I did. My trust in her was a deeply ingrained habit, the default setting of my heart for 15 years. But my mind, now free from the fog of disease, was beginning to work with its old, analytical precision. The small dissonances I had noticed before were now becoming a pattern. She became fiercely protective of her laptop and phone, angling them away from me when she worked. She started talking about a new online support group for caregivers, spending hours in private video calls with people I never saw or heard. When I asked about it, she said they were her lifeline, the only people who truly understood the trauma she had been through. It sounded reasonable, but it felt secretive. The catalyst, the event that finally forced me to open my eyes, was a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, a thick envelope from a financial planning firm I didn't recognize, addressed to her. I handed it to her, and she snatched it from my hand with a speed that was startling, her eyes darting to see if I had noticed the logo on the envelope. She quickly stuffed it into her purse, her smile a little too bright, her movements a little too jerky. "It's just junk mail, an offer for a new credit card," she said, a little too quickly. And in that moment, for the first time, I knew she was lying. The trust I had placed in her for 15 years didn't just crack, it shattered. That night after she was asleep, I did something I had never done in our entire marriage. I went into her purse. My hands trembled with a mixture of guilt and a cold, sickening dread. I found the envelope. It was not junk mail. It was a quarterly statement for a private investment portfolio. The account was in her name only. I opened it. The numbers blurred together, a meaningless jumble, until one figure leaped off the page: the account's total value. It was a substantial six-figure sum, money we were not supposed to have. Where had it come from? I scanned the detailed transaction history, my heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. And then I saw it. The account had been opened 3 years ago, right after my diagnosis. The initial deposit was a large lump sum. I recognized the amount instantly. It was the full death benefit payout from my life insurance policy. I stared at the paper, my mind refusing to process the information. It was impossible. The policy only paid out upon death. I was alive. I kept reading, my mind working like a detective's, piecing together a crime I didn't want to solve. I saw a series of emails that had been printed out and included with the statement, a correspondence between Corrine and a man named Marcus Thorne, her financial advisor. I read the first email, and the air left my lungs in a single, ragged gasp. In the email, Corrine was discussing a creative solution they had engineered. She had, with the help of a complicit doctor, managed to have me declared terminally and irreversibly ill, a specific clause in the policy that allowed for an early, partial payout of the death benefit to cover end-of-life care. The money I thought we were spending from the sale of our house was, in fact, my own death benefit. She had cashed me in, but that was only the beginning. The rest of the emails laid out the entire monstrous strategy. Her plan, in consultation with this Marcus, was to use a portion of the payout to fund my care, while secretly investing the majority of it. The investment strategy was aggressive, high-risk, designed for rapid growth. The projections were all based on a single grim variable: my projected date of death. They had a timeline. They had a number. My life had been converted into a set of variables in a financial equation. Her loving care was not an act of devotion, it was risk management. She was keeping me comfortable, managing my decline, all while waiting for her investment to mature. My unexpected recovery, my medical miracle, was not a blessing to her. It was a catastrophic market downturn. It was the one variable she hadn't planned for. Support group The Secret calls. It was likely her and Marcus, frantically trying to salvage their plan to figure out what to do with the husband who was stubbornly refusing to die and liquidate his own asset. I sat there in the dark, the damning papers spread out before me, and I felt the last 15 years of my life collapse into a black hole of pure, calculated evil. The angel I had worshipped was a monster. Her sacrifice was a lie. Her love was a fraud. She hadn't been my caregiver. She had been my undertaker, patiently waiting for the corpse to be ready for burial. The silence that followed my discovery was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I put the papers back in her purse, my movements precise and robotic, and went back to bed. I lay there, staring into the darkness, my body rigid, my mind a screaming chaos. I was lying next to a stranger, a predator who had been patiently tending to her prey. Every memory of her kindness, every sacrifice, every gentle touch was now reframed, tainted by the cold, sociopathic logic of her plan. Her tears were not for my pain, but for the risk to her investment. Her sleepless nights were not from worry, but from the thrill of the gamble. The woman I loved had never existed. I had been married to a ghost, a character she had invented for the sole purpose of a monumental heist. For the next week, I lived inside a waking nightmare. I played the part of the recovering, grateful husband, while my mind worked with a cold, furious clarity I hadn't felt in years. I was an engineer again, but the problem I was solving was not structural or mechanical, it was existential. I was deconstructing the architecture of her lie, looking for the load-bearing walls, the weak points, the precise place to plant the explosives. I needed more than just the financial statements. I needed the full story. I became a spy in my own home. I put a keylogger on her laptop, a piece of software that recorded every keystroke. I placed a voice-activated recorder under the small desk where she made her support group calls. It felt like a grotesque violation of a privacy I once held sacred, but I knew now that our entire marriage had been a violation of my trust, my life, my very soul. The information I gathered was more damning than I could have ever imagined. The keylogger captured her emails and chat logs with Marcus Thorne, her financial advisor, and it became clear, her partner in more than just finance. Their correspondence was a sickening mixture of cold financial planning and intimate personal disdain for me. They referred to me as the asset, the patient, or sometimes just him. They discussed my medical reports with the detached analysis of traders reviewing a stock's performance. His numbers are stabilizing, which is problematic for the timeline. We may need to consider a more aggressive exit strategy if he continues to improve. The implication of that phrase, the chilling ambiguity of it, made my blood run cold. But the audio recordings were the true masterpiece of her monstrosity. I listened to hours of her calls with Marcus. Her voice was unrecognizable. The warm, compassionate tone she used with me was gone, replaced by a sharp, cold, commanding one. She was the architect of the plan and he the eager accomplice. I heard them celebrate my initial diagnosis. I heard them joke about my physical struggles. I heard her express profound frustration and anger at my recovery. He was supposed to be gone by now, Marcus. I heard her say in one recording, her voice a venomous hiss. This miracle has ruined everything. All that capital just sitting there, tied to him. We have to figure out a way to sever the asset from the liability. The asset was the money. The liability was me. I was the problem she needed to solve. In one of the final recordings, they discussed their next move. Plan A had failed. I had stubbornly survived. So they were moving to Plan B. Lyra was going to convince me that my recovery, while wonderful, had left us in such a precarious financial state that we needed to make a drastic move. She was going to propose that we move to a cheaper, more manageable country, perhaps somewhere in South America with a lower cost of living, and I now realized more relaxed banking regulations. Once there, she would convince me to sign over what little was left of our assets to her for management. And then she would simply disappear, leaving me stranded, penniless in a foreign country. Her final act was not to be murder but abandonment, a clean, logistical severing of the liability. The evidence I had compiled was a perfect, self-contained narrative of a breathtakingly evil crime. I had the financial documents, the incriminating emails, and hours of recorded conversations detailing their intent and their conspiracy. I made copies of everything, storing them on multiple encrypted drives, which I sent to a trusted lawyer and my brother, with strict instructions to open them if anything happened to me. I was now ready. My confrontation was not going to be a tearful, emotional scene. She was immune to that. I needed to speak to her in the only language she understood, the language of assets and liabilities, of profit and loss. I chose a Tuesday, the anniversary of the day I had been given my life sentence. I sat her down at our small kitchen table. I didn't present the evidence. I simply looked at her, my expression a mask of cold, emotionless calm. "Corrine," I began, my voice steady. "I've been doing some financial planning of my own. I've been assessing my assets and my liabilities, and I've come to the conclusion that you are my single greatest liability, and liabilities, as you know, need to be severed." The color drained from her face. Her mask of the loving wife dissolved, replaced by a flicker of pure, animal panic. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice a little too high. "I'm talking about the Edelweiss project," I said, using the name I had heard them use on the recordings for their plan. Her panic turned to stone. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing into slits. The cornered animal was now a predator ready to strike. "I've reviewed the entire project file," I continued, my voice never wavering. "The initial investment, the risk management strategy, the unforeseen market complications, and the proposed exit strategy. It was a bold plan. A little sloppy in the digital security department perhaps, but ambitious. Unfortunately for you, the primary asset has become self-aware and is about to liquidate your entire position. I took out my phone and placed it on the table between us. I pressed play. Her own voice filled the small room, cold, clear, and utterly damning. He was supposed to be gone by now, Marcus. This miracle has ruined everything. I let the recording play for a full 30 seconds before stopping it. She was silent, her face a pale, rigid mask of fury. There was no apology, no remorse, no explanation, just the cold, hard rage of a master strategist who had been outplayed. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous threat. "No," I said, standing up from the table. "I won't. I've spent the last 4 years of my life in a prison, Kareen, first in my own body and then in your lie. The only thing I regret is not seeing the truth sooner." I turned and walked out of the apartment and out of the ruins of my life without looking back. My angel was a demon, my savior was my assassin, and my entire world had been a lie. But for the first time in a very long time, I was finally free. Thank you for listening to my story here on Reddit Whispers. Now I want to hear from you. What's the most unexpected, life-changing decision you've ever made when everything seemed to fall apart? Share your thoughts in a comment section, because you never know, you might be the one that someone else needs to hear today.